At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 180 knots through the black skies north of the Philippine Islands. 26 years old, 43 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. The Japanese had sent 12 bombers to destroy the American airfields that night. Smith knew the pattern. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. American engineers were building 2 airfields to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion. The Japanese understood what those airfields meant. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could cover the entire invasion force. The Japanese had to stop construction. They sent bombers every night, conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything that could carry explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro on December 26th, 3 days earlier. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. The pressure was suffocating. Every bomber that got through meant dead engineers, dead construction crews, delayed airfields, a delayed invasion, more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was different from anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Top speed, 366 miles per hour. But the real weapon wasn't the 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, watching a glowing screen that showed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Philip Porter was Smith's radar operator. He'd been tracking targets for 6 months. He knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The problem was simple. 1 P-61, 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, 11 others would slip through to bomb the airfields. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Smith shot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. The airfields would be damaged. The invasion schedule would slip. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months. Night fighter training at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, radar intercept procedures, night navigation, gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. No visual references, no horizon, just instruments and radar returns, and the hope that the target you were tracking wasn't friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, flying P-70 Havocs at first, then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters weren't. Stable, forgiving, powerful. The radar actually worked. But radar couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were coming. His fuel would last maybe 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could only intercept 3 bombers before he had to return to base. 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties. Maybe thousands if they hit the fuel dumps or ammunition storage. If you want to see how Smith hunted down 4 Japanese bombers in total darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. He had 4 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. Smith had to make a choice, which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in one night was genius or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness. No moon, no stars. Heavy clouds obscured everything. This was why the Japanese chose tonight. Complete darkness meant their bombers were invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose. The dish sent out microwave pulses at 180 degrees forward. When those pulses hit an aircraft, they bounced back. The radar operator's scope showed the return as a glowing blip. The scope had two displays. One showed azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose. The other showed elevation, above or below the aircraft. Porter watched both scopes simultaneously. He guided Smith toward the target using verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. The system worked because Porter was exceptional at his job. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope. A smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. When the target got close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot's scope was simpler than Porter's. Just one display showing range and relative position. But it was enough. Once Smith had the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M. The Americans called it Betty. 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kase engines. Maximum speed 270 miles per hour. Crew of 7. Bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had a critical weakness. No self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar. No way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards. Still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. The blip grew larger as the range decreased. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it. A dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible. Faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position. Slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. Fixed forward. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds. 800 rounds total. Enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close. Fire. Confirm the kill. Move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The four cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high-explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft illuminated the clouds below. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. One bomber down, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope, all heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 on December 30th. Heading 180. Altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster. 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down. Or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most night fighter missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous. Even with radar, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night was nearly impossible. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since arriving in the Pacific Theater. 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4 kills to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range, 4 miles. 3 miles. 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile. Same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one. 6,000 feet instead of 8,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would turn into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it. But fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range, 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately. Then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down. 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both were at different altitudes. One at 9,000 feet. One at 4,000 feet. And they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly. But the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, 1 bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range, 7 miles. Heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed, 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament. 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streaked past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks. Necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0029, 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing, or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target. Heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative, but this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. 1 chance, 1 burst, then he had to return to base. Whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying, Smith fired at 0034, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact, but Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact, heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfields Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died, because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. The Americans called it Frank. A single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 miles per hour, 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons, one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, That meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel. Barely. At 00:52, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long. Crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 00:55, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway. Altitude, 800 feet. Airspeed, 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees, or coral reefs, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time, not enough to divert to another airfield. Taqlabad on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%, and the darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61 stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin. Not much. But descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle, or construction areas, or coral reefs. At 00:58, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear under the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard. Collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 0103, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort. Pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining, enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115. They wanted details. Times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, all destroyed between 2357 on December 29th and 0046 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters, but Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 1512, Porter detected a contact. Heading north. Altitude 12,000 feet. Range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight. But Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61 Times-a-Wastin continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, It was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art. The kill markings. The aircraft that hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes. All lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, operating from Mindoro, provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29th enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with radar. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
On the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942, a panzer crew somewhere east of Voronezh was moving through steppe grassland when the engine seized. Not from enemy fire, not from combat. The transmission simply failed, the intricate gears grinding to a halt in a landscape where a broken tank became a coffin. The commander ordered the crew to abandon, to run toward the supporting infantry positions 300 yards away. They made it 40 yards before Soviet anti-tank guns found them. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how panzer crews were supposed to die. And yet this scene played out again and again across the vast Eastern theatre, not because German tankers were poor soldiers or their commanders incompetent, but because the machines they piloted were fundamentally unreliable in ways that would significantly degrade panzer force capability. The conventional narrative suggests that German tanks were mechanical marvels, engineering masterpieces that dominated their opponents through superior design and firepower. The Tiger tank, the Panther, the Markiv, these names evoke images of formidable steel machines that could only be stopped by being surrounded, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But that story obscures a fundamental reality that German tankers and their commanders understood all too well. Those magnificent machines were also nightmares of maintenance and reliability, mechanical systems so complex and demanding that keeping them running became as much a battle as fighting the enemy. And when they broke down, which they did constantly, the men inside them paid a price in casualties that far exceeded what the performance in combat might suggest. To understand how Germany's vaunted panzer force could suffer casualties, at rates comparable to or exceeding those of their opponents, despite possessing, tank for tank, superior firepower and armor, we need to examine something that rarely appears in the glossy photographs and technical specifications. We need to look at what it meant to maintain these machines in the field, how often they broke down, what happened to crews whose tanks became immobile, and how the engineering choices that made German tanks formidable in combat made them vulnerable and fragile in the grinding reality of sustained operations across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. Here's where the story gets interesting. In 1942 and 1943, when the Panzer Arm was at its height, German tank forces suffered from a peculiar and devastating problem. Their casualty rates didn't correlate with combat losses in the way you'd expect. Analysis of German records shows that throughout 1943, Panzer units reported that mechanical failure and the consequent abandonment of tanks accounted for a significant percentage of vehicle losses, with operational readiness rates for Panther units sometimes dropping as low as 16 to 35% on any given day, far below initial deployment expectations. This meant that units nominally equipped with dozens of vehicles often had only a handful actually capable of combat operations. And crews that couldn't move were crews that had to choose between staying with their tanks and being captured or burned when the enemy overran their position, or abandoning them and running through shell-swept terrain where enemy anti-tank guns waited. Many chose to run. Many didn't make it. The root of this catastrophe lay in the fundamental design philosophy of German tank engineering. German tank designers, particularly at firms like Henschel and Mann, approached tank design with an emphasis on advanced features, powerful weapons, and superior armor. But every advance required complexity. The transmission systems in German tanks were masterpieces of engineering, and also fragile, over-engineered systems that demanded constant maintenance and precise operation. The Maybach transmission in the Panther tank, for instance, was sophisticated enough to give the Panther remarkable mobility and maneuverability for its weight class. But it was also a transmission that required highly trained drivers, regular maintenance that was difficult to perform in field conditions, and replacement parts that became increasingly scarce as the war progressed. A Soviet T-34 tank of the same era had a transmission that was comparatively crude, less refined, less mechanically elegant. It was also dramatically simpler to maintain, easier to repair, and less likely to fail catastrophically in the middle of a combat operation. This pattern repeated throughout German tank design. The engine systems were powerful and efficient, designed to deliver excellent power-to-weight ratios. But they were also sensitive to the quality of fuel available in the field, vulnerable to overheating when driven hard in dust and heat, and required careful management by drivers who understood their specifications intimately. The cooling systems were refined and effective but fragile, easily damaged, and difficult to repair when damaged. The electrical systems were sophisticated but prone to failure and dependency on batteries that had to be carefully managed. The suspension systems, particularly the interleaved roadwheel suspension used on many German tanks, were remarkably effective at distributing weight evenly across difficult terrain, but they were also maintenance nightmares. When one roadwheel was damaged, the entire set often had to be replaced, a process that could take hours or days in field conditions and required access to specialized tools. Soviet tank designers approached the same problem from a completely different angle. The T-34, and later the T-34-85, were designed with simplicity as a core principle. They were built to be operated and maintained by conscript soldiers with minimal training. The transmission was simple and tough. The engine was a V12 diesel that was forgiving of poor fuel quality and could run hot without immediate catastrophic failure. The electrical systems were minimalist. The suspension was uncomplicated. The guns were effective but not as sophisticated in their fire control systems. The armor was well sloped, and armor protection per ton was excellent. But the overall design philosophy was built around the assumption that tanks would be operated in large numbers by soldiers of varying skill levels, in conditions where replacement parts were scarce and mechanics had limited training. German design philosophy operated from different assumptions. Germany was an industrial power with sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, skilled workers, and access to high-quality materials and precision manufacturing. German tanks were designed for highly trained crews, for armies with extensive maintenance infrastructure, for operations in conditions where replacement parts could be manufactured on demand, and where skilled technicians could be dispatched to repair damage. This design philosophy worked brilliantly in Western Europe in 1940 and 1941, where operations were relatively brief, supply lines were short and well organized, and damaged tanks could often be recovered and repaired. It worked less well in North Africa, where supply lines were tenuous and replacement parts impossible to obtain. But it became catastrophic in the Soviet Union, where distances were vast, supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. The environment was hostile to precision machinery, and losses of tanks meant losses of irreplaceable resources that couldn't be replaced by local manufacturing capacity. The Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943 saw panzer units operating hundreds of miles from their supply bases, maintaining tanks in conditions of extreme heat and dust in summer, extreme cold and mud in spring and autumn, and snow and cold so severe that engines wouldn't start in winter. In these conditions, the sophisticated German engineering that made their tanks superior in other contexts became a vulnerability. The Maybach engines in Panther and Tiger tanks were exceptional power plants, but they required fuel of consistent quality and temperature management that was nearly impossible to achieve in the field. Tank crews reported that in summer, engines would overheat and seize if driven hard for sustained periods. In winter, starting the engines required preheating with blowtorches or braziers. Replacement engines were heavy, took enormous effort to install, and as the war progressed, became almost impossible to obtain. Consider what it meant for a panzer crew to suffer a mechanical failure in combat. The tank commander looked out his hatch and saw the engine temp gauge climbing into the red. The driver reported loss of power, smoke rising from the engine compartment. The commander knew that if they stopped to let it cool, they'd be stationary and vulnerable. If they kept moving, the engine might seize completely. Either way, they were in trouble. If they managed to get the tank to stop in a covered position, they then faced hours of waiting for the engine to cool enough to work on, while mechanics, if any were nearby, attempted to diagnose the problem. Many mechanical failures couldn't be repaired in the field. They required evacuation to a recovery point. But evacuation meant getting a heavy wrecker vehicle to the site, extracting the disabled tank without having it seized by Soviet forces, and moving it miles to the rear. In the meantime, the crew was without their vehicle, scattered among other units or sitting in rest areas, casualties mounted. The transmission failures were particularly devastating. Panther tanks suffered transmission problems at a rate that shocked German commanders. Internal German reports indicate that in 1943, Panther units sometimes had only a fraction of their vehicles operational on any given day, not because of combat losses, but because of transmission failures, engine problems, and suspension damage. When a Maybach transmission failed, and the complex multi-speed transmission in the Panther was prone to failure, the tank became immobile. A Panther in 1943 was extremely costly to produce and represented an enormous investment of resources. To simply abandon it was unthinkable. But recovery was difficult, time-consuming, and dangerous. Crews attempting to recover damaged panzers often came under fire themselves. The Tiger tank, Germany's most famous tank, suffered from similar reliability issues that are often overlooked in popular histories. The Tiger's 88mm gun was one of the most feared anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front, earning its reputation through both technical performance and the psychological impact it had on Soviet tankers. Its armor protection was excellent. But the Tiger was also mechanically complex. The Henschel transmission used in the Tiger required precise operation. The engine was powerful but sensitive. The suspension, while robust, required constant maintenance. Internal German reports and post-war analysis suggest that Tiger tank battalions typically had operational rates, the percentage of tanks actually capable of combat on any given day, of around 50 to 60%. This meant that a Tiger tank battalion nominally equipped with 45 tanks might have only 25 to 30 tanks actually ready for operations on any given day. The remainder were in maintenance, undergoing repair or awaiting replacement parts. This reliability crisis created a vicious cycle. Panzer units suffered mechanical losses that removed tanks from combat. This meant that available tanks had to work harder, had to be driven longer distances, had to be pushed to their limits to compensate for the reduced numbers. Pushing the machines to their limits accelerated wear, increased the rate of mechanical failure, and put more crews at risk. As the war progressed and replacement tanks became scarce, the pressure increased. By 1944, panzer divisions were sometimes operating at 30 to 40% of authorized strength, with much of the difference due not to combat losses, but to mechanical failures that couldn't be repaired because replacement parts didn't exist. The human cost of this mechanical unreliability manifested in several ways. First, crews became casualties when their tanks broke down in combat situations, and they had to abandon their vehicles. The Soviet response to a disabled panzer was immediate and predictable. Anti-tank guns shifted fire onto the stationary tank. Artillery was called in. The crew had minutes to evacuate before the tank was destroyed. Evacuation meant running across open ground under fire, moving without the protection of armor, exposed to fire from multiple directions. Some crews made it, many didn't, and even those who made it often suffered wounds from shell fragments or direct fire from small arms that the crew of a functioning tank would have been protected against. Second, casualties occurred during maintenance and repair operations. Tanks that broke down in forward areas often had to be maintained under fire. Mechanics worked on engines and transmissions while artillery landed nearby. Recovery operations. The process of towing disabled tanks out of the combat zone were extremely dangerous. Heavy recovery vehicles moving across open terrain were vulnerable targets for anti-tank guns. Recovery crews suffered casualties at rates that often exceeded those of combat soldiers. German records indicate that recovery and maintenance operations accounted for a significant percentage of Panzer Corps casualties, particularly among the technically trained personnel who couldn't easily be replaced. Third, the sheer numbers of disabled tanks in the front lines meant that enemy forces often encountered and could destroy German tanks that weren't being actively operated. A Panther waiting for parts or recovery became a stationary target, sometimes destroyed by Soviet infantry armed with magnetic anti-tank charges, sometimes overwhelmed when enemy forces overran the position. German tankers reported the deeply demoralizing experience of watching their tanks destroyed by enemy infantry while the crews were off getting supplies or resting, unable to defend the vehicles they'd worked to keep running. Major tank engagements on the Eastern Front illustrate these reliability problems in dramatic fashion. During Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, Panzer forces achieved stunning victories against Soviet tank formations, in part because German tactical coordination and crew training was superior, but also because Soviet tanks were being deployed in larger numbers across more dispersed positions. But even in these victories, German tank units found themselves running out of operational vehicles, not because of enemy action, but because of mechanical failures and the difficulty of maintaining sophisticated machines across vast distances. The retreat from Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 and early 1943 saw panzer units lose an enormous percentage of vehicles, not in the fighting around the city itself, but in the extended operations across the steppe as German forces maneuvered, attempted to break through Soviet encirclement, and finally withdrew. In the freezing cold and mud, engines seized, transmissions failed, and tanks became immobilized. Recovery in these conditions was nearly impossible. Vehicles were abandoned in extraordinary numbers simply because they couldn't be kept running. The operational rates of panzer units dropped to levels that alarmed German high command, not because of tactical defeats, but because the machines simply couldn't function in the environment they were operating in. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, among the largest tank battles of the war, demonstrates the problem from another angle. German forces committed large numbers of new and upgraded tanks, including many of the advanced Panther tanks. The hope was that these machines, with their superior firepower and armor, could achieve a decisive victory against Soviet forces. But the battle also saw extraordinary mechanical attrition. Panther units suffered such severe transmission problems that some battalions lost the majority of their tanks to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Tiger tank units reported that within the first few days of the battle, operational rates had dropped dramatically due to engine failures, transmission problems, and suspension damage. These weren't failures caused by enemy action or poor tactics. They were failures caused by the fact that the machines were being driven hard for extended periods in dusty conditions, and they simply couldn't maintain the pace. Soviet tank forces at Kursk, by contrast, operated T-34 tanks and T-34-85 tanks that, while not as individually capable as the new German tanks, demonstrated much higher operational reliability over extended operations. Soviet tankers reported that their machines, while undergunned and under-armored compared to German tanks, had the tremendous advantage of starting reliably in the morning, running consistently through the day, and requiring maintenance that could be performed by mechanics with minimal training. When Soviet tanks were damaged, repairs could often be made with parts that could be fabricated in the field or with minimal tools and expertise. This reliability advantage, multiplied across hundreds of tanks operating for weeks, translated into a significant operational advantage that Soviet technical historians would later emphasize when analyzing the battle's outcome. The problem of reliability was well understood by German commanders. General Heinz Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg tactics and a commander deeply familiar with panzer operations, expressed serious concerns about reliability problems in his reports and memoirs regarding panzer force limitations. Guderian emphasized that panzer forces were constrained not primarily by enemy opposition, but by the difficulty of maintaining their vehicles in field conditions. Replacement parts were constantly in short supply. Skilled mechanics were stretched thin across multiple units. The demand for replacement tanks far exceeded production capacity, and the vehicles that were available often suffered failures that took them out of action for extended periods. The solution German High Command attempted was reorganization. Panzer divisions were consolidated and reorganized multiple times throughout the war as commanders tried to achieve more effective operations with fewer vehicles. Tank crews were rotated back for additional training, though by 1943 this became increasingly difficult as the personnel demands of the war expanded. Maintenance facilities were organized into dedicated repair depots in the rear areas, attempting to create specialized repair capacity that could handle complex transmission and engine work. But these organizational solutions could only partially address the fundamental problem, which was that the vehicles themselves were over-engineered for the conditions they were operating in and the resources available to maintain them. By 1944, the reliability crisis was compounded by the introduction of yet more advanced and complex vehicles. The King Tiger, an even more heavily armored and heavily gunned tank, had operational rates that were sometimes so low that entire units could only field a handful of operational vehicles at any given time. The Jagdpanther tank destroyer and the Panther I represented further increases in complexity that German industry simply couldn't support. These vehicles required even more specialized parts, even more skilled maintenance, and even more resources to keep running. And as German industry came under increasing air attack and resource constraints, even basic replacement parts became scarce. The experience of individual tank crews illustrates these problems from the perspective of the men who lived with these failures. According to post-war accounts from Tiger tank commanders, mechanical failures were among the most frustrating and dangerous aspects of tank warfare. They described situations where Tigers developed transmission problems after only a few days of operations. Repairs often took a week or more, during which crews were separated from the rest of their battalion, exposed to enemy action without their vehicle, and sometimes forced to take refuge in an infantry position. When repairs were finally completed and the Tigers were returned to combat, transmission failures sometimes occurred again within days. Many tank commanders who survived the war recalled that their vehicles were eventually destroyed in combat or abandoned when mechanical failures took the tank out of action once again. Post-war accounts from Panther commanders reported similar experiences. Tank commanders described the constant state of anxiety about mechanical failure. Every movement of the tank, every engagement with the enemy, was colored by the fear that the transmission might give out or the engine might seize. This anxiety translated into battlefield behavior. Tank commanders became conservative in their movements, avoiding hard driving that might accelerate mechanical failure, which sometimes meant missing tactical opportunities. Crews spent hours in maintenance and repair, learning to diagnose problems, attempting fixes in uncomfortable and exposed positions, living with the constant knowledge that their vehicles might fail them at the worst possible moment. The physical toll of operating these machines was significant in ways often overlooked in accounts focused on combat casualties. Crews spent hours every day maintaining their vehicles. In extreme heat, mechanics worked on engines and transmissions, often with limited shade, exposed to sun and dust. In extreme cold, they worked with frozen metal, struggling to remove and replace components that had been seized by ice. The engines of German tanks often had to be preheated before they would start in cold weather, which meant that crews would sometimes stand watch on idling engines for hours before a movement order came through. This constant maintenance work, performed under difficult conditions, contributed to fatigue that itself became a casualty factor. Tired crews made mistakes. Mistakes in tank operation increased the rate of mechanical failure. Mechanical failure increased danger and stress. The loss of experienced personnel due to extended casualties and rotations for training meant that even crews fortunate enough to receive the best vehicles often lacked the expertise to maintain them optimally. By 1944 and 1945, many panzer units were operating with crews that had minimal training, commanders with little experience, and maintenance personnel who had been hastily trained and were doing their best under impossible circumstances. This lack of expertise exacerbated mechanical problems. Mistakes in maintenance increased the rate of failure. Operational procedures that deviated from optimal practice accelerated wear, and when vehicles broke down, repairs took longer because the mechanics weren't skilled enough to diagnose and fix the problems quickly. The broader context that made these reliability problems so devastating was the strategic situation on the Eastern Front. German panzer units had to operate across enormous distances, often in advance of infantry support, with supply lines that were constantly under attack by Soviet partisans and air forces. A single panzer division might be responsible for holding a front line extending tens of kilometers. Replacements for vehicles lost to mechanical failure came slowly from factories deep in Germany, traveling by rail across thousands of kilometers, often under air attack. Replacements for maintenance parts came through bureaucratic supply channels that were often overwhelmed, and as German industry came under increasing pressure from Allied bombing campaigns, the supply of parts became increasingly sporadic. Soviet tank forces, by contrast, while suffering losses at a higher rate than German tanks in direct engagements, could replace them with relative ease from Soviet factories located deep in the Soviet Union, protected from German air attack and operating at high production capacity. Soviet tankers had to deal with their own reliability issues. Soviet tanks were notorious for poor ergonomics and uncomfortable working conditions. But the fundamental difference was that Soviet strategy accepted and planned for losses, building redundancy into operations and accepting that tanks might only survive a few months in combat. German strategy, by contrast, attempted to maximize the quality and longevity of individual vehicles, which meant that losses had outsized impact on operational capability. The photograph or combat footage of a disabled panzer being approached by Soviet troops tells a story of these reliability failures that most historical accounts overlook. That tank likely broke down not because it was surrounded and overpowered in combat, but because a transmission failed, or an engine overheated, or suspension components failed due to wear and inadequate maintenance. The crew, seeing the vehicle immobilized and enemy forces approaching, had to make the split-second decision to either stay with the tank and be captured, or burned alive if the enemy poured fire into the hull, or evacuate and run across open ground toward friendly positions. Many chose to run. Many of those who ran were killed or wounded by enemy fire that their armor would have protected them from. Those were casualties of mechanical failure as much as casualties of enemy action. By 1945, the entire panzer force had effectively been severely degraded by the combined weight of combat losses and mechanical attrition. German tanks that survived individual battles often didn't survive the next movement order because the maintenance necessary to keep them running wasn't available. Crews were exhausted from trying to maintain vehicles that demanded constant attention. Factories were producing fewer replacements as production capacity was destroyed by Allied bombing. And the fundamental mismatch between the complexity of German vehicles and the resources available to maintain them had become so acute that German tank forces faced catastrophic constraints on their operational capability. Tank crews took enormous casualties, not only because enemy forces were stronger, but because their vehicles increasingly failed them at the most critical moments. What this history demonstrates is a principle that extends far beyond tank warfare. Engineering designed for optimal conditions and unlimited resources is fragile when operating in degraded conditions with limited resources. The sophistication that made German tanks superior in direct tank versus tank combat became a vulnerability in the grinding reality of extended operations thousands of miles from their industrial base. Soviet tanks, designed with the assumption that they would be operated in large numbers by less trained crews in conditions where parts were scarce, proved far more robust in practice. This wasn't a matter of engineers being less clever or less skilled. German engineers were among the best in the world. It was a matter of design philosophy. The choice to optimize for maximum performance in the hands of highly trained crews with excellent maintenance support created machines that were vulnerable when those conditions didn't exist. German tank crews paid in blood for this design choice. The casualties they suffered extended far beyond those killed in direct combat with Soviet tank forces or anti-tank guns. They included tankers killed while attempting to repair broken vehicles under fire, mechanics crushed when recovery operations went wrong, drivers killed when disabled tanks were overrun, commanders burned in tanks that couldn't move out of danger, and crew members wounded in countless incidents directly or indirectly caused by mechanical failure. The total number of these casualties, the cost in blood of designing for perfection in a world of imperfect and chaotic operations, was never fully calculated by German high command, but it was substantial, and it represented a real strategic cost to Germany, because those casualties and those damaged vehicles represented resources that couldn't be committed elsewhere. The Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943 was supposed to be where the Panzer Force demonstrated its superiority and achieved decisive victory over Soviet tank forces. Instead, it became the crucible in which the fundamental vulnerability of the Panzer philosophy was revealed. German tanks were tactically superior in almost every combat engagement, often engaging enemy tanks at ranges where Soviet guns couldn't penetrate their armor, while German guns were devastating. But strategic victory eluded German forces, in part because their vehicles, for all their sophistication and firepower, simply couldn't sustain the pace and scope of operations across the vast Eastern theater. They broke down. Crews died trying to fix them, recover them, or escape from them. And in a war of attrition, which the Eastern Front proved to be, attrition was something Germany couldn't afford. The casualties of equipment failure were thus not separate from the casualties of combat. They were woven through every operation, every battle, every day of the war. A crew that survived a transmission failure in the summer of 1943 might be killed in a different vehicle or as infantry 6 months later. A panzer division that lost 30% of its strength to mechanical failure in autumn might have to be withdrawn from the line for the winter, not for rest, but because it lacked sufficient operational vehicles to maintain a coherent defense. And the cumulative effect, multiplied across dozens of panzer divisions operating across thousands of kilometers over multiple years, was to create a situation where the vaunted Panzer Force found itself increasingly unable to perform its intended function. What happened to the Panzer Force and its crews demonstrates that casualty rates and operational effectiveness are determined not only by the skill and courage of the men involved or the quality and performance of the weapons they use, but by the sustainability of those weapons across the full range of conditions they encounter. Equipment designed without adequate margin for error, without redundancy, without acceptance of degraded performance, becomes brittle. It fails at the worst possible moments, and when it fails, the men who depend on it pay the price. German tank crews understood this truth, even if German high command sometimes seemed not to. They lived with unreliable machines in hostile territory, far from repair facilities, knowing that mechanical failure could be as deadly as enemy fire. Many of them paid with their lives for engineering choices made years earlier by designers who couldn't have imagined the conditions in which their vehicles would eventually be operated. And in the end, that cost in blood was among the significant factors that contributed to the Panzer Force's inability to achieve the strategic victory that German planners had envisioned.